don't analyze your fuel. If you need to use revenge as your fuel to become successful, which you want, then use it.
You might want to consider doing this. So number one is hold that thought for just a second.
In 2020, a relatively unknown entrepreneur sat down in front of a camera and made a decision that most people in business would consider insane. He decided to give everything away.
This is the entrepreneur life cycle, and there are 6 stages. Now, the vast majority of people get stuck on stage 3. I've made some of the biggest career mistakes at this point, and you end up living the same 6 months for 20 straight years, suffering.
Every framework he'd spent a decade building, every pricing strategy, every sales script, every operational playbook that had taken him years of failure to develop. For free, on the internet, to anyone who wanted it. No paywall, no course, no coaching program you had to buy first, just free. His wife thought he was losing his mind. Most of his peers definitely did. But Alex Hormozi had figured something out that almost no one else in business had yet understood. That in the modern economy, the most powerful currency isn't money. It isn't equity. It isn't even time. It's attention. And he knew exactly how to spend it. 3 years after that first video, Hormozi had over 4 million followers across YouTube, Instagram, and X combined. His books, 100 million offers and 100 million leads, had sold over 1 million copies worldwide. And Acquisition.com, the business he'd built underneath all of that free content, well, generating north of $200 million a year. But here's the thing. Here's the part that almost every person who talks about Alex Hormozi gets completely wrong. The content is not the business. The content is the bait. And understanding the difference, understanding how he turned raw attention into compounding, scalable, asymmetric leverage, well, that is the entire story. So, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand where he ended up, you have to understand exactly how far down he once was. 2013, Towson, Maryland. Alex Hormozi is 23 years old. He's just quit a management consulting job he hated, turned down the path his father wanted for him, and done something that, on paper, made no sense at all. He opened a gym. Not because he had a plan, not because he had capital or mentors or a network, because he believed if he outworked everyone, things would work out. They didn't.
Hey guys, I'm Alex, and I'm the owner of United Fitness. Take a quick look at this video to see if you're ready to take the 6-week challenge.
Within a year, he was sleeping on the gym floor because he couldn't afford the lease on an apartment.
And when I was sleeping on the gym floor, I'll give you a detail that'll tell you that the stack of undeniable proof.
He was eating 1 meal a day to cut costs. He was sending cold emails at 2 a.m. to gym owners asking if they'd pay him to come in and fix their businesses. Because he had figured out, through brutal trial and error, what actually made a gym profitable. Most of them ignored him. A few said yes. And that small, desperate, almost humiliating pivot was the origin of everything. He didn't start with a vision. He started with a problem he'd already solved. That gym consulting model eventually became Gym Launch Secrets, a company that between 2016 and 2019 would go on to generate over $30 million in revenue. But more importantly, it taught Hormozi the first lesson that would come to define his entire philosophy. He had figured out how to make someone else's business work, and then he'd figured out how to package that knowledge and sell it. The question that started nagging at him was this: what if, instead of selling the knowledge, he just gave it away? What if the act of giving it away was itself the business model? He wouldn't answer that question fully for another few years, but the seed was planted. By 2019, Gym Launch was doing over $1 million a month. They sold a portion of that business, and with that money and that experience, they started asking a bigger question. Not how do we scale one business, but how do we scale the process of scaling businesses? That question gave birth to Acquisition.com, a portfolio model where Hormozi and his team would take equity stakes in companies, inject capital, and then, crucially, inject knowledge. The playbooks, the frameworks, the hard-won lessons from years of operating. But there was a problem. For that model to work at scale, the founders they were partnering with needed to already understand the way Hormozi thought. They needed to speak the same language, have the same mental models. You can't teach foundational business thinking inside a deal room. It takes too long, it's too expensive, and it doesn't scale. So, Hormozi did something that, at the time, felt almost counterintuitive. He decided to teach it in public, for free, to everyone. In 2020, Hormozi made a decision that most people in his position wouldn't have made. He was already doing well. He didn't need the content. He wasn't broke, he wasn't desperate, he wasn't trying to build a personal brand for validation. He started making content because he had a strategic thesis. And the thesis was this: the person who teaches the most wins. Not wins in some vague inspirational sense, wins specifically, mechanically, financially. Because if you can get thousands of entrepreneurs to think about business the way you think about business, if you can install your mental models into enough people at scale, then a certain percentage of those people are going to want to work with you, invest with you, send you their best operators, refer their best founders. And none of that requires a single cold call. No sales team, no paid ads, no outbound, just content. So, he went all in, and the approach was unlike almost anyone else in the space at the time. Not the surface level stuff, not the things that sound good in a tweet, the real frameworks, the counterintuitive stuff, the things that were working inside actual businesses. And the reasoning was simple. If you're afraid to give away your best ideas, it's because you think your ideas are the competitive moat. Hormozi believed the competitive moat was execution, relationships, and trust, not information. In the age of Google, information is not scarce. Trust is. And giving away your genuinely best thinking is the fastest way to build it. So, while other creators were spending weeks crafting a single polished video, Hormozi was publishing constantly.
What's going on, everyone? What's going on, everyone? What's going on, everyone? Welcome back.
Instagram carousels, YouTube breakdowns, short-form clips, long-form podcast episodes. He talked about it like training a muscle. You don't get better at communicating by waiting for the perfect thing to say. You get better by saying 1,000 things and learning what actually lands. He also understood something about how algorithms work. They don't reward quality in isolation. They reward consistent quality over time. Volume was the mechanism. Quality was the filter applied to that volume. And this is the one that made his content genuinely different and genuinely dangerous to his competitors. Now, most business content on the internet is outcome-focused. Here's how I made $1 million. Here's how I got 10,000 customers. Here's the result. But Hormozi's content was mechanism-focused. Not what happened, but why it happened. The underlying logic, the causal chain, the first principles behind the tactic. And that's harder to make, but it's infinitely more shareable. Because when someone understands the mechanism, they can apply it. And when they apply it and it works, they become an evangelist. Not of the content, but of the worldview. And that is a fundamentally different kind of loyalty than entertainment creates. So, by 2022, the content was working in a way that was difficult to comprehend from the outside. Instagram posts regularly hitting millions of views, a YouTube channel growing at rates that baffled veterans of the platform. And the books, 100 million offers, published in 2021, hit bestseller charts with a traditional publisher without a PR campaign, without a book tour, just an audience that had already bought into the worldview. Here's the part that almost every analysis of Hormozi's content strategy overlooks. The content was never really about the content. So let's talk about what Hormozi actually built, because it is more elegant than most people realize, and the elegance is entirely in the loop. Step 1. Content creates trust at scale. Hormozi publishes frameworks, breakdowns, and case studies that entrepreneurs find genuinely useful. They apply it, it works, and they tell other people. The audience grows. Trust compounds. Step 2. Trust creates warm inbound. Because of the content, when Acquisition.com announces they're looking for portfolio companies, they don't get cold strangers. They get founders who have been consuming Hormozi's content for months or years, who already think in his frameworks, who already trust his judgment. The due diligence process on both sides is dramatically compressed because the communication overhead is already gone. These founders don't need convincing, they need a decision. Step 3. The portfolio validates the content. So when the frameworks actually work inside real companies, when the businesses Hormozi invests in grow, and those founders publicly credit the Acquisition.com playbooks, that becomes the most powerful content of all. Real results, real proof, not from Hormozi himself, but from operators in the field. And those successful operators send more operators, more founders, more deal flow. Content builds the audience builds the deal flow validates the content, repeat. And this is what leverage actually looks like in the modern economy. Most people think of leverage in the traditional sense, financial leverage, using debt to amplify returns on capital. But Hormozi's version is informational leverage, using publicly distributed knowledge to attract, pre-qualify, and convert exactly the people you want to work with, without a sales team, without a marketing budget, without cold outbound. Content does the qualifying, and by the time someone shows up in a conversation with Acquisition.com, they already know the vocabulary. They already share the mental models. They already believe in the approach. That is not a coincidence. That is architecture. Now, the clearest example of this leverage loop in action is the book strategy. $100 million offers was published in 2021 at a price point that was, well, frankly, absurd given the density of content inside it. $9 on Kindle. Hormozi has been explicit about why. The book is not a revenue source. The book is a trust-building mechanism. The book is a filter. Because anyone who reads $100 million offers and finds it valuable has already demonstrated something important. They care about the fundamentals of business. They're serious. They're coachable. They're exactly the profile of founder that Acquisition.com wants to work with. The $9 book is the cheapest possible customer acquisition vehicle for a business that writes 7-figure checks. And because Hormozi isn't optimizing the book for profit, he can make it as genuinely good as possible, which makes more people buy it, which grows the audience, which generates more inbound. It's a flywheel. And once you understand it, you start to see it operating everywhere in what he does. Now, it's worth pausing here, because there is a temptation to look at what Hormozi has built and assume the strategy was obvious in hindsight. It wasn't. Every core decision he made ran against the conventional wisdom of his industry at the time he made it. And when most business influencers were building courses and charging thousands of dollars for information, Hormozi gave the information away and charged for equity. When most investors were staying out of the spotlight, Hormozi put himself completely in it, not for vanity, but because he understood that public trust was a form of due diligence. When most creators were chasing virality, Hormozi was chasing depth. Videos about pricing models and sales conversion rates don't go viral. They accumulate, they compound, they build an audience that is smaller in relative terms, but orders of magnitude more valuable in terms of intent and purchasing power. He wasn't optimizing for views, he was optimizing for the right views. And this distinction matters enormously, because it speaks to something fundamental about how attention actually functions as a business asset. Attention is not homogeneous. 1 million views from people who are mildly entertained is worth considerably less than 100,000 views from people who are actively trying to solve a business problem. Hormozi's content was built for the second group. Not because the first group isn't valuable, it is. Because the second group converts. The second group buys books. The second group fills out deal applications. The second group becomes operators inside portfolio companies. He wasn't building an audience. He was building a pipeline disguised as an audience. And there's another dimension to this that doesn't get discussed enough. In the world of private equity and business investment, reputation is everything. And reputation has historically been built slowly, through closed networks, through referrals, through decades of quietly doing good deals. Hormozi compressed that timeline dramatically. So by building a public-facing personal brand, he created a form of social proof that operates at a speed and scale that traditional reputation building simply cannot match. When a founder in rural Ohio who has no connection to any venture network stumbles across a Hormozi video about pricing strategy and it changes the way they think about their business, they haven't just discovered content, they've developed trust. And that trust is portable. It travels with Hormozi's name into every deal room, every pitch conversation, whether he is physically in the room or not. The personal brand isn't marketing, it's infrastructure. Now, no story like this is complete without a fair look at the other side, and there are legitimate critiques of the Hormozi model. The first is survivorship bias. The frameworks Hormozi teaches worked in specific contexts, in specific markets, at specific moments in time. So not every principle translates cleanly to every industry or every stage of business. The gym launch model that made him rich required a specific market dynamic that doesn't exist everywhere. The offer engineering frameworks in 100 million offers are powerful, but they aren't universal laws. They're tools, and tools require context to use well. The second critique is about the feedback loop. So when a content creator's business depends on their content performing, there is always an incentive to frame things in a way that makes the model look good. Hormozi has been more transparent than most about failures, but the selection of what gets shared is still ultimately his. And the third critique, and perhaps the most important one, is about replicability. The Hormozi model works because Hormozi is, well, Hormozi. The specific combination of communication ability, operational experience, work ethic, and timing that made this flywheel spin the way it did is not a template that anyone can simply pick up and execute. You can take the principles, you can apply the frameworks, but you cannot shortcut the decade of operating experience that made the content credible in the first place. The content works because the results are real. The results are real because the frameworks were tested in the field. And that sequence matters. It cannot be faked. That's not a reason to dismiss the model, of course. It's a reason to be honest about what's actually driving it. But zoom out here for a second, because I think the Hormozi story is pointing at something much larger than one person's business model. I think we're in the middle of a fundamental shift in how trust is established in commercial relationships. And for most of the 20th century, trust was built through institutions. You trusted the bank because it was, well, a bank. You trusted the advisor because, well, they had letters after their name. And you trusted the firm because it had existed for 30 years. But that model is now breaking down, and into the vacuum left by eroding institutional trust has stepped the individual, the person who shows their work publicly, who gives before they ask, who builds trust through demonstrated competence rather than through inherited credentials. The new credential is public proof of work. Hormozi didn't invent this shift, but he understood it earlier than most, and he built a business model specifically engineered to exploit it. And what he figured out, what the attention to leverage playbook actually represents, is a new kind of business architecture. One where the product and the marketing are the same thing, where giving away value and capturing value are not competing objectives, but a single, unified motion. Where the most powerful sales tool is not a pitch deck or an ad campaign or a conference booth. It's trust, built in public, over time, at scale. Now, we started this video with a single word, free. And I think it's worth asking, why does that word make so many people in business uncomfortable? Why does the idea of giving your best thinking away without conditions, without a paywall, without asking for anything in return, why does that feel like a risk? Well, I think it's because most of us are operating from a scarcity model, where ideas are finite, where sharing means losing, where the secret is the moat. Hormozi, on the other hand, operates from an abundance model, where ideas compound when they're shared, where giving creates trust, where trust is the moat. And the numbers, the followers, the book sales, the portfolio, the $200 million, well, those numbers are not the argument for his approach. They're the consequence of it. Alex Hormozi didn't build a media company that happens to invest in businesses. He built a trust machine, and then he bolted a portfolio onto it. Attention was always just the starting point. Leverage was always the destination.